At 1:30 in the morning on Christmas Eve, 1945, a sudden blaze reduced a timber home to smoldering ash in under an hour. The official police report closed the case immediately, citing faulty wiring, but the ashes held a physical impossibility that would challenge early forensic science. In the mid-1940s, fire investigation was a flawed system relying entirely on visual observation rather than chemical analysis. Investigators lacked the tools to test for accelerants. They relied instead on a quick glance at the debris. If a house burned down, the local fire chief simply assumed the most obvious cause. There were no protocols for preserving a fire scene. There were no specialized laboratories to detect traces of gasoline. This lack of scientific rigor meant evidence of foul play could easily be buried. The standard procedure for a rural fire involved little more than a visual sweep. After the flames died down, investigators walked the perimeter, looking for a clear point of origin. If they found a melted fuse box, the investigation stopped right there. These severe forensic limitations meant that complex crimes masked by fire were almost never solved. Without a way to measure burn temperatures, authorities treated structural fires as simple accidents. A proper search for human remains required careful excavation and sifting ash through fine mesh screens. It also required consulting experts who understood how bone reacted to extreme heat. But in rural jurisdictions, these techniques were entirely unknown. Grieving families were left at the mercy of an uneducated guess. The consequence of this primitive standard fell heavily on the small community of Fayetteville, West Virginia. Located deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Fayetteville was a town where local authorities held absolute trust. When a massive tragedy struck, the community expected quick answers, but the local infrastructure was unequipped to handle a complex, fatal event. The rapid assumptions made by officials would fracture the town's trust forever. Because the local fire department lacked training, the immediate aftermath was handled with chaotic haste. The site of a destroyed home was often bulldozed within days. This was done to remove dangerous debris and spare the community from looking at the wreckage. But this rapid clearing process destroyed whatever fragile clues might have survived the flames. The true cause of a fire remained permanently hidden. The sudden disappearance of 5 young children into the ashes of their own home shattered the quiet security of the town. Neighbors were suddenly thrust into a state of profound shock. The sheer finality of the official ruling offered no comfort. It only provided a chilling realization that an entire family could simply vanish without a single trace left behind. The absence of physical remains created a deep, emotional void that was impossible for the surviving family to process. Grief requires a focal point, a body to mourn, or at least a definitive answer. Without these basic elements of closure, mourning turned into a desperate obsession. The survivors were forced to constantly question reality, searching for their missing children in the faces of passing strangers. This agonizing uncertainty became the defining reality for George, the patriarch of the devastated household. An Italian immigrant who had built a successful trucking company, he was accustomed to solving problems through direct action. When authorities told him to accept the loss and move on, his practical mind refused. He could not accept their flimsy conclusions without concrete proof. He knew the physical properties of the materials in his home. He understood that human bone does not simply evaporate in a standard house fire. His transition from a grieving father to a relentless investigator began the moment he realized the police were not going to help. He began piecing together a series of strange encounters that had seemed harmless at the time. In the late autumn months, the atmosphere around the family property had grown tense. A stranger had appeared at the house looking for work. This man wandered to the back of the property, pointed to a pair of fuse boxes, and ominously warned they would cause a fire someday. The property itself sat along a busy highway, making it easily accessible to anyone passing through. The house was a large timber structure, filled with heavy oak furniture and a coal-burning stove. It was solidly built and carefully maintained by a family that took pride in their hard-earned stability. But the surrounding landscape of dense woods and dark, unlit roads provided perfect cover. Anyone wishing to approach the home unseen during a freezing winter night could easily do so. The Sodder family operated as a highly organized, self-sufficient unit. Older siblings looked after the younger ones while the parents managed the business. This internal system relied on strict routines, clear communication, and a deep sense of mutual protection. Every member of the household knew exactly what to do in an emergency. The older boys were intimately familiar with the layout of the home. Because of this tight-knit structure, the idea that 5 healthy kids could be trapped in their bedrooms without making a sound defied all logic. The older children were strong enough to break a window. The escape routes had been discussed and understood by everyone. The family dynamic was built on an immediate response to danger. Their absolute silence during the roaring blaze became deeply baffling. When the smoke first filled the lower hallways, the immediate response was a frantic sequence of attempted rescues. But these efforts were systematically thwarted by bizarre obstacles. The father raced outside to grab his tall extension ladder, which was always stored in the exact same spot. But on this specific night, the ladder was missing. It was later found dragged deep into an embankment away from the structure. Desperate to reach the second-floor windows, he ran to his 2 heavy coal trucks. He intended to pull them up to the house and climb on top of the cabs. Both trucks had functioned perfectly the day before. Yet now, neither engine would start. The water barrels sitting outside were frozen solid. The surviving family members were left completely powerless as the roof finally collapsed inward. The horrific consequence of these failed rescue attempts fell directly on Jenny, the mother who had to watch her home burn. She stood there believing her children were trapped inside. But when the ashes cooled and the brief search yielded absolutely no bones, her grief transformed into a powerful suspicion. She began to conduct her own grim experiments. She burned animal bones in her stove to test the heat. Her private experiments proved what the local authorities refused to admit. A standard wood fire simply does not burn hot enough or long enough to completely destroy human bone. This profound realization meant that the official narrative was scientifically impossible. Jenny was left with a chilling conclusion that would dictate the rest of her life. She held a total conviction that her missing children had been deliberately taken. For decades, the psychological weight of that missing physical evidence consumed Jenny. She simply could not mourn children she believed were still alive. Instead of planning funerals, she meticulously documented every strange tip and reported sighting that arrived in the mail. Her grief became a relentless, obsessive search for living faces. The family eventually erected a massive billboard along Route 16 displaying the black and white faces of the 5 missing children. This towering wooden sign was not just a plea for public assistance. It was a permanent monument to a mother's refusal to accept an impossible forensic conclusion, broadcasting her unresolved tragedy to every passing driver. The specific timing of the disaster permanently altered how the family and the town experienced the holiday season. December 24th stopped being a time of celebration for anyone who knew the story. It transformed into an annual, unavoidable marker of profound loss and deeply unsettling questions that surfaced every single winter. As neighboring houses strung up festive lights and gathered for normal winter traditions, the surviving family members faced a very dark anniversary. The sharp contrast between cheerful community rituals and the stark reality of their missing siblings forced them to quietly relive the terrifying events of that night, year after year. The physical site of the destroyed home was eventually bulldozed and covered with a thick layer of fresh dirt. George planted a memorial garden directly over the footprint of the old foundation, hoping to bring some peace to the site. But during the harsh winter months, the frozen, barren ground beneath the snow looked like a permanent scar on the landscape. Standing tall above this quiet plot of land, the famous billboard weathered decades of harsh elements. Freezing rain and heavy snow battered the painted faces of the 5 children year after year. The large wooden sign loomed over the icy highway, serving as a stark visual reminder of the mystery that dominated the hillside. The glaring failures of this 1945 investigation exposed a critical systemic need for better fire science. Today, forensic investigators do not simply declare a site completely destroyed after a quick visual sweep. Modern protocols require sifting through ash with specialized screens and chemical analysis to locate even the smallest microscopic fragments of biological material. The disaster became a textbook example of why potential crime scenes must be strictly preserved from outside interference. The immediate bulldozing of the site had destroyed any chance of a proper secondary search. Consequently, legal and institutional standards shifted to mandate that fire scenes involving missing persons be treated as active crime scenes until definitively proven otherwise. For the family, the human aftermath was defined by a lifetime of procedural dead ends. George and Jenny spent their entire life savings hiring private investigators and chasing leads across multiple states. They meticulously filed reports and tracked down individuals who resembled their missing children, only to face continuous legal and investigative walls at every turn. Both parents passed away without ever receiving a definitive answer or recovering a single piece of confirmed physical evidence. The responsibility of maintaining the billboard and fielding occasional tips fell entirely to the surviving children. They managed the family archives and public inquiries, carrying the heavy burden of a flawed investigation into the 21st century. Eventually, the iconic billboard was taken down, leaving that stretch of Route 16 quiet and empty. Yet the sudden absence of the sign perfectly mirrors the central tragedy of the fire itself. It remains a haunting story defined entirely by what is missing, leaving behind nothing but an empty space and an enduring silence. Subscribe for a new story every week.